Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be talking about a very important, necessary part of Marvel Snap, how to snap, right? So, this is definitely a very popular question I get on the YouTube, on the streams. How do you snap? When should I snap? What should I be thinking about when deciding to snap? All these questions we're going to try to cover. This is definitely not a topic I can cover in one video, but I do want to have something out that people can watch and kind of start to understand how to snap, what to think about, and how to navigate a game of Marvel Snap. So let's get right into it. Let's get started. So, most important question: what is the art of snapping? I would say that snapping is knowing that you're ahead in the match before your opponent knows that they are behind. That's essentially what snapping boils down to, figuring out the right time and the right moment to take advantage of that gap in knowledge between you and your opponent. So, this is something I see a lot. Some examples where people will play down a card, react to a location, see what happens, and then snap. So I do have some examples, right? So if you play Wong and then after the Wong gets through, you snap, you're doing it completely wrong. That's not the art of snapping. The art of snapping is to snap before you play the Wong because they don't have that information that you have the Wong and you're about to play it, and it's enough of a power swing to win the game. So that's something I see a lot. Same thing with Leech. You want to snap before the Leech comes down because as soon as the Leech comes down and it hits their key targets, and then you snap, they're going to leave. So you need to be snapping before your opponent knows that they are behind. Same thing with Professor X, right? If you play the Professor X, you lock down the location, then you snap. That's not how you actually get people to stay. That's not how you actually get the cube advantage. You want to be snapping before they realize, oh, you've done something that they can't react to, that they can't deal with, and then it's time for them to leave. Same thing with like locations. Gamma Lab. If you can like fill up a Gamma Lab, you know they're not likely running a Shang-Chi, and you can fill it completely before they can react. You want to snap before turn 3, before the Hulks appear, because if you snap after you have a full board of Hulks, well, they're just gonna leave if they can't win the other two lanes. Same thing with Wrath. You want to snap before you get your 6 cost card. All right. If you can fill that location a turn earlier than your opponent, you want to make sure that they pay for it. If they're staying in the game, they're paying with an extra cube. Same thing with Bar Sinister. If you have something like Green Goblin on turn 3, you want to snap before you play the Green Goblin, right? So I see this happen a lot. People snapping after they've done their powerful play, after um, the game has swung in their favor. You want to snap before your opponent knows that the game has swung. So that's just something, a concept you have to understand. It's very important. You've got to be snapping before your opponent knows they're behind. So I just wanted to drill that in. That's the most important thing to learn from this video. Now, there are some things you need to focus on before you snap. It's not just snap here, snap here. There are a lot of different variables to consider before you finally decide to snap. Your location, your hand, the enemy composition, your composition, the counters, the tech counters that you might have in your deck, the tech counters that your opponent might have in their deck, and then the time spent taking the turn. So we're gonna go through these one by one, just kind of explaining what each of these mean. So locations, right? I think this one's pretty self-explanatory. A big part of the game, you have to be understanding how does your deck work with the locations on the board. So something people do often, I just as well, is snap before we have a full grasp of what locations are available, right? So there are locations that appear that change on turn 4. There are locations appear every single turn until turn 3, right? You might snap turn 1 or turn 2, right? You might not have a full grasp of what the locations will be available, but the locations that are available, how do they react to your deck, right? how much better does it make your board state, and how much better does it make your opponent's board state. And understanding that dynamic is definitely a core part of deciding whether and when to snap. Next up, we have your hand, right? So if you have a fantastic hand, right, that can be a reason to snap. Same thing as if you have a poor hand, that can be a reason to wait it out, see if you can hit something better. A good thought process to have is if you can play out your full curve from your hand, you can consider snapping because you know you're not going to get a bad draw because all the draws you need are already in your hand. So let's say if you start with Sunspot into Armor into Zabu into Moon Girl, right? Like that kind of start is already so strong, so consistent that you could consider snapping just from these 4 cards. So it's a tool you can use. I wouldn't say your hand is the most deciding factor, or even an important factor, but it's something you want to make sure that is in the back of your mind. If you're snapping without respecting your hand, and then your next draws are very poor, right? You could turn a potentially powerful snap into, oh, I'm wagering 4 cubes out of nowhere. So you have to consider the fact that you can draw badly, and if your hand's already good, that is something you can just you can put on in the checklist of snapping. Next up, we have enemy compositions, right? So how does your deck work with the enemy composition? Can you identify the composition your opponent's playing before you snap, right? So if they play something like Bucky Barnes on 2, I think it's pretty clear that they're very likely going to have a destroy composition, and then you could make that judgment call of, is a destroy composition good versus my comp? Do I usually win versus these type of compositions? Same thing with Darkhawk, right? If maybe you're running like a rogue in your list, am I favored into a Darkhawk matchup? Do they usually beat me, right? So understanding what your opponent can play, what they are playing, and how likely or how favored you tend to be due to previous experience is definitely a huge part of understanding when and where to snap. So this is something you just have to test out, play the game, see how, when you win, when you lose, why you're winning, what you're winning against, and then having that repertoire of like, oh, I win against this, I lose against this, I win against this, lets you know whether you're making a safe snap, a safe snap, a smart snap, a dumb snap, a silly snap, you know, that kind of thing. There's definitely levers or risk associated with the snap you're taking, and these these ideas are just helping you figure out how favored, how likely, what makes a snap good or favored or likely for you to actually win out the game, and what makes a snap poor or not really a good idea to do. Next up, we have tech answers. So this is a big deal. Does your deck run answers to meta compositions, right? If you're running a Killmonger, that's going to do really well against decks that play a ton of 1-drops. Are you running Leech? It's going to do well against specific type of decks that need their cards to have a ton of stats. Leech into Patriot is horrible, but Leech into other types of decks can be really, really good. Shang-Chi is very common, and just knowing if you have answers to compositions your opponents are playing makes that snap a little bit more freeing, because you know, oh, if I draw this card, or if I already have this card in my hand, I have a really easy matchup into these compositions. So just being aware of the answers that you can have and answers that your opponents are likely to play, right? Shang-Chi goes into a lot of compositions. Magneto goes into a lot of compositions. Leech goes into a lot of compositions. So if you know, oh, they could be running a Leech here, that's going to make your decisions a little bit more difficult, because you got to be thinking, okay, if they Leech me here, am I still ahead? Am I still winning? Can I still win? And if the answer is no, then you got to be careful with that snap, because if they have a Leech in their hand and you're snapping to them, they're like, well, I'm about to play Leech on you next turn. Well, that, you messed up somewhere. So these are the things you have to be thinking about before you're snapping. And then the last one we're going to talk about today is time spent. So there's actually an importance to how much time people are spending in their turns. Opponents delaying their turns can tell you important information, whether they're feeling scared, whether they're thinking about leaving, or whether they're thinking about like what they need to be playing. So sometimes a location can really screw them over but you're still playing for 2 cubes. Nothing's really going on, but they're like, I'm so behind. I don't know what do I even do here. Da, 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 da. Snapping into that moment of deliberation can really be the deciding factor. It's like, okay, he snapped, I'm gonna leave. So you can like force a leave because they're taking too long because something's messed up in their plans, as well as taking a long time can also be uh, a way for you to actually get an opponent to leave. So let's say it's turn 4 and you're really taking a long time in your turn. They've done their turn, they're just waiting for you. And then out of nowhere you start snapping. Like it's like near the end of time and you're like, okay, I guess he's figured out exactly what he's doing for the next till the end of the game, and I guess he knows what's up. I'm gonna leave. So you taking a long time can also be a tool to snap and then encourage your opponent to leave, as well as they taking a long time can also be the same tool for you to snap and pressure them to leave. So you have to be understanding the situation, what's going on the board, what's going on in your hand, and what they're thinking about, what you should be thinking about. So it's not very easy to be like, oh yeah, turn 4, always snap. Like it's not that simple, right? You have to be thinking about the game and what's going on to figure out how you're using uh your the knowledge available to you and the snap, which I would say is a tool. Snapping is not just a mechanic; it's actually something that gives you valuable information in a match. Your opponent snapping can tell you a lot. Your opponent not snapping can tell you a lot. When they snap can tell you a lot. When they don't snap can tell you a lot. So that's a little bit more like too hard to go into for this video, right? This video is already getting long, but um, it's something I want you to start thinking about, start keeping in mind. Like, oh, they snapped here. What does that mean, right? Like, maybe you're not thinking like that, but I always think, okay, why did they snap? What does that mean? What are they saying with this snap here? So it's just something you always want to start thinking about in your games. Like, why are they snapping? What does that mean? Should I be expecting this? Like the act of someone snapping can make me change my play. And if you've never had that thought, like, oh, they snapped here, I should do something else, like, then that's something you should start considering. The fact that they're snapping could mean like, oh, maybe that means they actually have an answer to this play that would be normal. So let me do something, deviate from the standard and do something different because my normal play would now be bad into someone who has this direct answer. So just something to start thinking about in your own games. And then a basic tip is the stronger your deck, the better your odds. I think this is pretty clear cut. But if you have a deck that's really good into the meta, wins a lot, right? Just snapping is generally going to be better because you generally win more games, and if you win more games, then snapping means you'll do better over the long run because you'll be getting more cubes per snap than you lose. So just something just nice. I know most people are like, well, my deck's just really bad, blah blah blah. But yeah, just if you find a good deck against the meta, like take advantage of it. If your deck's really good, like into a feature location, take advantage of it. If you have a really good deck that just always does well, if the hot location shows up, take advantage of it, right? Snap into those situations because if your deck is that good or is favored into those locations and things like that, you have to make sure that you're playing the odds to your favor, making sure you're snapping whenever those situations arise. All right, now I have this example. I have this nice little example, just kind of showcasing the power of snapping, what snapping means, things like that. So we have this like turn order, right? Turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, turn 6. You have you, the player, and then you have your opponent, right? So turn 1, right? Both players don't really have enough information. They think they're even. Turn 2, you think, okay, you got a good hand, you got a good location, you think you're ahead. But the opponent doesn't really know, right? The locations don't matter for him. Doesn't matter that his hand is okay. Turn 3, you're still ahead, right? And you're gonna think you're ahead till the whole game. But turn 3 is when now they know they're behind. Third location's bad. Things aren't looking good for them. So now they know they're behind. Third 4, things a little bit settled down, and he thinks he's even again. Turn 5, he thinks he's ahead. Turn 6, he realizes, okay, now he's behind. Da, 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 da. So I wanted to talk about like snapping in every turn. Like it can mean something different when every single turn you snap. It actually can have different results. So turn one snapping, right? Usually pretty reckless. You don't have enough information. Some people do it. It can work because people can leave into a turn one snap because there's not enough information to know like whether you're ahead or behind a lot of the time. So you can't people like I don't want to risk that cube. They can just leave, or their hand is like actually bad and they just leave. So you can do that, but a lot of times people can stay and it makes sense to stay. Turn two, however, that can be a pretty powerful turn to snap. So if you snap turn two, I would say a player like this, your opponent shouldn't leave, right? He thinks he's even. The opponent is just snapping willy-nilly, doesn't really tell you too much. Opponent wouldn't really leave. Turn three, when your opponent realizes they're behind and you realize you're ahead, this is where you can get your opponent to leave. I would say turn one, your opponent doesn't leave. Turn two, your opponent doesn't leave. Turn three, this is where your opponent should actually leave, right? Because they realize they're behind. You realize you're ahead. You snap onto them that turn three. They're like, okay, I'm unlikely to win. I'm gonna leave, right? Turn four, if you didn't snap and you snap turn four, now they think they're even again. They'd actually stay. They'd actually be willing to stay because like, okay, you think you're ahead. I actually don't think you're that ahead, so I'll stay. Turn five is pretty interesting, right? This is really the only turn the opponent would snap here. This is the only turn they actually think they're ahead. You might think you're ahead, your opponent, but this is the turn like, okay, I have a big play here. I'm actually gonna snap. So if you snapped anytime before turn five, you're never getting a snap from your opponent. But only at this window, this small turn here, would your opponent feel confident enough to snap. So that it's kind of interesting. If the max you can get in a game like this is 4 cubes, unless you don't snap until turn five, where your opponent actually thinks they're ahead. That and you also think you're ahead. That's really the only window where you can actually get an 8 cube match out of this because any other turn it doesn't make sense. And then turn six also, this is where most likely they're gonna leave unless maybe they've snapped the previous turn and they're now too into the game to leave, right? So 4 cube games a lot of times turn to 8 cube games unnecessarily, in my opinion, where people are too invested into the match to give your opponent the 4 cubes for free. They want you to fight it out. They want you to guarantee it, even though they know that they're behind. So that would probably be the very likely chance you'd get 8 cubes if your opponent snapped the previous turn and then they're too invested to leave. But in a lot of cases, if you snapped in any of the previous turns, they realize turn six they're behind, they're gonna leave. So most of the time, you're gonna get 2 cubes from a game like this. But the only window where you could even get 4 cubes is if you wait for them to snap turn five, and the other time you get 6 cubes is if you wait for them to turn five to snap, and then you just like let they become invested, right? And they make a mistake of staying in, even though they realize after that turn they became behind. So that's really the fascinating nature of it. The only time you could really get your opponent to leave is if you snap turn three. If you snap turn 1, 2, 4, or 5, they would actually stay in, right? Because they don't feel behind. It's only that specific window on turn 3 or turn 6, to be fair. Like if you snap turn 6, they could also leave, right? So let's say you snap turn, they snap turn 5, you don't snap back turn 5, and then turn 6 you snap, then they leave, right? So you would only get your 2 cubes, but you'd have to snap exactly the same turn as them for you to actually get the 8 cubes, because then they'd become invested, right? You're playing for 4. It's hard to leave from that position. So this is kind of an interesting example of the power of snapping, how you can force people to stay in, how you can force people to leave. It's definitely a little bit high level. I wasn't sure I wanted to put this in, but you know, I'm definitely gonna go over this again in future videos. But this is something to think about in your games, just like understanding the philosophy of snapping and the art of snapping and figuring out how to get the most cues from players. Um, Now there's still a little bit more to talk about here. If you're not actually ahead, snapping too early can be very risky. And I kind of messed up in the tips video where I suggested if you have Zabu just snap, because that's kind of like beginner level advice where it's good, if you're fighting people that also don't have Zabu. But especially once you're getting into the high MMRs, the high rankings, a lot of these players will have Zabu. So that advantage of having a Zabu is fairly neutralized because they also have the Zabu. So you just create high stake games like constantly, basically. And if you're not playing the game out like fairly or like smartly, making sure you're playing the game in a good way, you can just constantly be losing 4 cubes, 8 cubes, 4 cubes, and you just make your swing so wonky. So definitely, if you're like climbing through the ranks, 10 to maybe 70, it's easy to just snap if you have Zabu. But as people get better, as more people have Zabu and more people understand the mentality of snapping with a Zabu, you just create situations where you snap and you're like, I have a Zabu, and they're like, well, I have an Enchantress or a Rogue or whatever. I have an answer to that, and then you just lost 4 cues, right? Because they're gonna snap back into you, and then they're gonna play the Enchantress on 4, and you're just behind, right? And you either go and commit the 8 or you just give 4 for free. So it's definitely something I wanted to give good advice, but that one I've been hearing a lot of people like, I'm swinging 10 ranks, like going from 90 to 80 in one day. And I'm just like, okay, you're snapping too risky or too rapidly and too risky. So you do have to be careful about snapping early. And the Zabu advice is basically just encouraging players to snap early, right? Which can backfire. So I wanted to take a look. So we have this previous example. I want to take a look at the same example, except this time your opponent actually becomes ahead and wins, right? So this is something that happens a lot, where you think you're ahead, but then the opponent either has a tech answer or a counter answer or a good play, a good turn, good location, RNG, blah blah blah, and they become ahead. Now, this is where a lot of people will mess up, lose 8 cubes, things like that. Same story here. The only way to actually get out of this game ahead of cubes is to snap turn 3. Every other snap is really bad for you. Is disastrous. The only way is when you snap when you know you're ahead and you know your opponent knows they're behind. That can be if you're not too confident with your scenario, but the board looks scary. So let's say you play Zabu on 3, they didn't play anything on 3, but your hand is absolute garbage. Maybe the rock location came up and your hand's all rocks, right? And you've got nothing, but you have this Zabu on the board and they don't. That's you can snap into that even though your hands are rocks, just to force them to leave, because the pressure of that good scenario where they know they're behind this turn can just force them to leave. Things like that. So if we play this game out, right, and let's say you snap turn 1 or turn 2, right, which is like I have Zabu in my hand, I snap turn 1, turn 2, and what this allows your opponent to do is they always get to play until turn 6. If you snap early and they don't leave, they always get to play until turn 6. There's no drawback to playing the game out for until turn 6. So if you're actually not ahead, like if you're actually behind, even though you're snapping like you're ahead, they get to see the whole game. Turn 6, then they get to make their decision, right? And if they realize they're ahead even earlier than turn 6, right? Turn 5, turn 4, turn 3, they realize they're actually ahead, you're actually behind. They can counter snap you. And if you don't know that you're behind, right? Where you're like, I have Zabu, I always win. If you don't actually know you're behind, that's going to cost you 4 Qs minimum and very likely 8. Something people just have really big issues with is giving opponents 4 Qs for free. Like people just seem to not want to do that at all. Like, oh, we're playing for 8. And we're always I'm not giving them 4 for free. But you have to understand, like, you're behind. Like you're just giving them 4 extra cubes. You're losing another game for free. So that's definitely something that I just notice a lot of people just give extra cubes freely. So in this scenario, if you are actually behind turn 6, you're going to be losing a lot. So snapping early can be good, but there's this huge risk associated. This huge risk of you actually have to win the game if you snap early and they don't leave, right? So snapping early, if you know they feel behind, you know they feel pressured, can be great, right? Turns 3 snaps to guarantee a cube can be great. Turn 2 snaps, if you know you're ahead, can be fantastic. However, if you snap turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, and you're pretending to be ahead and they don't fall for it, now you're putting them in the position to counter snap you, snap ahead, snap the same turn, and guarantee 4 Qs for themselves. So you really have to be careful here. And in scenarios like this, like, it's just a very easy way to lose tons of cubes. So I just wanted to throw that in here. We're covering this a lot because it's so important. But yeah, this is definitely a video you're gonna have to watch multiple times. But unfortunately, it is what it is. And then we have some final thoughts here. There's no shame in leaving a close match and focusing on winning easier ones. There's gonna be great players, right? Like there's gonna be great snappers. There's gonna be great players, and there's gonna be great players that can do both snap and play the game very well, right? So if you have those hard matches and they're snapping you, like you don't have to stay in. Like I definitely hear some comments like, oh, you're leaving, how dare you leave? Just leave those hard matches. There's a ton of opponents and people are going to be easier. You're going to have better RNG in different games. There's no reason to play a game out for 4 cubes when you could just give the 1 cube and then win multiple 2 4 cube games. So just something I feel I need to remind players. There's no harm in leaving. And then last thing, what is not the art of snapping, right? Like what do I not condone? If you want to understand snapping, understand why to snap. Snapping is not snapping for for no reason. Just like, oh, it's turn 3, I'll snap. It's turn 4. I don't know why I'm snapping. That's not snapping correctly. Snapping because your opponent snapped. Just because, oh, they snapped me. Oh, how dare they snap me? I'm gonna snap. But no, that's not using your snap tool correctly. Snapping because they've beat you before. So I fall for this sometimes where I lose to a player, then I see them again, and I'm like, turn 1 snap. I want my cues back. That's not the correct way to snap, for sure. But yeah, I fall for it myself. Snapping because you want to climb faster, right? You get frustrated. You're like, I just want to climb. I just want 8 cubes. I'm just gonna snap. Like you're not really using the snapping feature to the greatest extent for the greatest reward, for the greatest payoff, right? So definitely climbing factor can be a motivator, but it shouldn't affect how you play. Theoretically, right? Obviously, emotions come in and blah blah blah, but theoretically. And then snapping because you're tired or you're tilted and you're not really thinking about the game. You're just like autopiloting, and you're like, snap here, da, da, da. Like that's not good, because if you're not thinking about the game, you're prone to make mistakes. You're prone to play an autopilot. If your opponent is thinking about the game and you're playing on autopilot, it's very likely they can predict what you're gonna do and play into that and counter it. So if you're tired, you're tilted, maybe it's good to just play no snap games, low cube games, and just like get back in the flow of it, get untilted, relax, take a break, that kind of thing. So if you're not thinking about why you're snapping, it's probably not a good idea to snap, because you're probably going to be making mistakes and and not foreseeing what your opponents are doing or thinking about. So that's the initial snapping guide. Definitely a long one, but there's definitely going to be more. I had more written, and I was like, this is already too long. So definitely look for the next one as it comes. But hopefully this helps. Just give like an intro, a starter to snapping, what it's like, how to do it, and what to think about. So yeah, definitely a long one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Have a wonderful day, everyone.